Thanks for joining us again for another in our Invisible Histories series of talks. Today, we're pleased to welcome Kirstie Blair from the University of Strathclyde, whose title is Prating of the Pit, Northern Miners as Writers and Readers in the Long 19th Century. This talk will run alongside our new guest exhibition, Literature in the Mines, from the Piston Pen Press project, a project which Kirsty manages alongside our next week's speaker, Mike Sanders. Everyone is very welcome to drop into the library on a Friday afternoon to see this free exhibition. More details are on our website. The library's events are as usual free. However, we would like to encourage you to support the library if you're able to do so. And there's a donate button on our website. Kirsty, over to you, thanks.
Thanks very much, Lynette. Let me just share my screen. And I'll get this up as a slideshow. It's doing. Okay, there you go. You can all see that. Excellent. Well, I'm very happy to be giving a talk that ties in to our nice exhibition banners at the library. And if you can't make it over to the library, there's quite a lot of information about literary miners on our project website here. If you're not following us on Twitter, do to keep up with all the interesting things that are happening in relation to this project. And you can also, if you're interested after this, go onto that Poetry Anthologies link you can see there and download a free PDF booklet of poems written by miners in Scotland and the North. Now, I did originally think, oh, I'll talk about the Lancashire mining districts for this talk, given that, you know, it's sort of technically located in Salford. But in fact, it's my colleague Mike at Manchester who's done most research into the Lancashire miners, along with my research assistant, Dr. Lauren Weiss. So I didn't want to end up presenting their research, and you can definitely ask Mike about the exciting things he's found in Lancashire in his talk next week, which I hope you'll be able to go to. So I'm going to focus more on the area in the north that I've been responsible for researching, which is Northumberland and Durham. What we're doing on this project is we're trying to join things up in relation to looking at industrial workers and how they participated in literary culture. So what I mean by that is we're not just looking at what did they write, we're also looking at how did they access books, how did they become literate, what did they read and where did they read it? And that ties into what kind of social and community cultures existed around these acts of writing and reading, what associations and societies did people belong to, and how did they use them to engage with different forms of literature, whether you're in a kind of group of friends who meet down the pub and recite their own poems and sing songs, as was very common, or whether you're a member of a, you know, quite organised mutual improvement society where you go along to listen to a lecture on Shakespeare from an eminent local clergyman. These are different forms of activity, but they all tie together. So what you're seeing on your screen now is a sneak preview of the database that we're in the middle of designing. Only 50% complete, so there's going to be a lot more flags on here. The red flags are workplaces that had somebody who was a writer or who left significant evidence about their reading activity, usually a writer. The circles you can see there are groups or individual writers. So when you click on a circle, this isn't live, this is a screenshot, but when you click on those circles, it will give you a list of all the people associated with that place. So the bigger the circle, the more writers are linked to a place. And the blue flags are for an association. So sometimes a workplace can be linked to an association. Association could also include library or reading room. So you kind of a blue flag and a red flag and a circle all on top of each other. And that might be, say, a Burnley factory worker who used the library supplied by his or her factory and who also belonged to the literary and debating society that was hosted and sponsored by the factory owners and took place in the factory schoolroom, and who also wrote poems and published them in a local newspaper like, say, the Cotton Factory Times. So eventually you'll be able to zoom in, click on all these links, and they take you through to information about the person, the place, the association, the workplace, and full text transcriptions of poems or short fictional extracts when they relate to industrial labour. So I'm zooming in today to think about an area in Northumberland. This list here is a set of collieries. They're roughly just above Newcastle on the map, near Blyth, which is on the coast. They're all within 10-ish miles of each other. And these names are the poets that to date we have associated with those collieries. So you can see that some collieries had, over the course of our period, but actually quite often within the same 20 years or so, 3 or 4 named writers that we know about. And this is, of course, not including any anonymous or pseudonymous writers who also wrote poems or songs or broadsides and published them in the local press, but who didn't sign them with their name. And it doesn't include all the people called John Smith who did sign them with their name, but we just are never going to be able to find anyone with a common name in the census records and in our newspaper searches. So this is really, this kind of database and project, it's never going to be complete, but it gives a real indication of just how rich literary culture was and how many people were down a mine writing poetry. And if you know mining history, especially mining histories of the North, there's been some great studies of leisure pursuits in terms of football and brass bands and so forth. And workers' libraries do get a mention in these studies, but poets, other than named famous poets like Joseph Skipsey, who's on this list for Backworth, have received relatively little attention as a collective. There's maybe 1 or 2 articles that look at mining poets as a group, and they don't look at them in this kind of local geographical context. So here's some of those people I was just talking about. Only about half of them are in the database yet because I haven't got to them alphabetically. But you can see bigger circles around Blyth. This is the historic map rather than the modern map. So you can see where the people are and where the circles are, and how close they are to workplaces and reading rooms. Here they are on Lauren's 1890s Ordnance Survey map, where again you can see the proximity of a colliery to an institute or a reading room, and the names of writers who we've been able to link to usually both the institute and the colliery. This is the kind of map I started out with when I started researching this, just so I could keep track, where these are the 4 Ersdon poets, 3 of whom worked at Ersdon Colliery, and the third one I can't find, but may have been the minister's daughter, which is interesting, but not a minor. And they were all associated with Ersdon Reading Room. In fact, 2 of these writers were actually also at school in Ersdon at the same time. So Ersdon Reading Room I'll start with as an example of a typical miner's reading room. It opened in 1857, and as was very standard, a respectable person like the village schoolmaster or often the local minister was the secretary, one of the most important roles in a reading room committee. Now, this was not a workplace reading room, but like many of these local reading rooms in industrial districts, it was strongly supported by the local workplace. So the colliery supplied coals, and coals are actually vital because the reason why reading rooms were used so much by working people, usually working men, is because they were warm and they were quiet. So they were a place for you to escape a very overcrowded miners' housing with family and lodgers and so forth, and go and sit by a fire in the evening and peaceably read the newspapers, which is very nice for you if you're a young man, less nice for your sisters and your mother, who are probably still stuck at home doing the washing the pit clothes. So this was a village reading room rather than a colliery reading room, which meant that the first committee was quite mixed. You can see shoemakers, farmers, stonemason, and a coal miner. It lasted all the way up till 1907, when F.J. Kitt, about whom more later, mentioned the old bookcases, the tables, and one chair. Having tables rather than just books in your reading room is really important because it is a site for reading. You're going there to sit and read. You're not going there just to borrow books. And mostly what you were reading was not even books, it was the newspapers and the magazines that these rooms would supply. Here's another example from the very nearby Cramlington Colliery Institute and Reading Room, a recollection from 1860, where they had 240 volumes, about typical for a small reading room, 83 members, a branch reading room at the Shank House pit. And here's the bit about patronage. We have the sympathy and support of the gentlemen of the neighbourhood and the other owners of the colliery in fitting up and contributing annually to the support of the parent institute and the branch at Shank House. Of course, you have to be polite about the owners of the colliery in a report that you're sending to the local newspaper that they're reading. But colliery owners were very strong supporters of these reading rooms. They donated books, they donated or sometimes built space, they provided coals, as we saw in the last example, and they often gave monetary contributions as well. And one from closer to here, Ringley. This is a nice example because it's a letter that was sent about the Ringley Improvement Reading Room to the Miner and Workman's Advocate, which is a radical union newspaper from the 1860s. And the letter, I was able to trace the author of the letter, who was a coal miner, and then I was able to trace Mr. Thomas Halliday, who's giving a speech in the letter about the benefits of education, as a coal miner and as someone significant to our project, because he didn't just have mining associations, he also had 2 children working in the mills. So this is a nice example of where those industries intersect. And the Ringley Improvement Reading Room and Cooperative Society was a great instance that we were able to put into the database of a worker-led reading room. So there's 2 ways that these spaces of reading came about. Either your employers decided to take initiative and set one up, or you, the men and women of the area, formed a committee and tried to set one up yourself and went out and asked for the patronage of the owners and the wealthy people in the neighbourhood. So these institutes or reading rooms, or often a reading room starts out as literally a very small room with some books and newspapers in it. And then by the end of the century, the 1880s, 1890s, it's a big fancy miners' institute building in beautiful Victorian Gothic with lecture halls and pool, billiard tables and so forth. But they were collaborative. So most frequently in the sources we found, initial interest either definitely comes from the miners or is reported to come from the miners. Obviously, when the owners say, all the men came to me and begged me to set up a reading room because they were so desperate to improve themselves and not to be in the pub, then it may be slightly suspect. Without help from local worthies, as I've been discussing, survival and expansion was very, very difficult. So when middle-class publication sources, for instance, the big Victorian periodicals like Blackwood's Edinburgh Magazine or well-established newspapers report on the movement to establish reading rooms, they see this as a way of inducing harmony between masters and men. The idea is get your miners into a reading room and they will read all kinds of improving literary works about religion and history and so forth. And this education will lead them to just become sort of better, but also more humble people. And then they won't want to go and strike, and they will appreciate the patronage of the masters, and harmony will ensue. And also reading rooms were often implicitly or explicitly set up as part of the temperance movement. So the other impetus here is set up a reading room and you're keeping your workers out of the pub and giving them a kind of quiet space to go that doesn't involve alcohol. However, this discourse is interesting because it does really seem in practice that it often backfired, because what happened when you got intelligent young men into a reading room and allowed them access to all the latest newspapers and periodicals and works of literature is they went and joined trades unions and became excellent public speakers and activists. And that's a kind of chicken and egg situation. You were more likely to use a reading room because you were already interested in developing yourself as someone who could fight for your fellow workers, but also you may have learned that these fights were going on and become involved with them through joining the reading room and meeting like-minded people. So there's a kind of circuit there. I'm thinking of Robert Smiley in Lanarkshire, one of the early Independent Labour Party founders and significant in the trade union movement in Scotland. And he actually writes in his autobiography, when I got appointed as a representative for the union, I knew I needed to up my knowledge of literature. So I joined the Lark Hall reading room, which was literally a room in someone's house. And I read my way through Shakespeare and Milton and so forth, because I needed to quote them in my speeches. I needed to show that I had that cultural knowledge. So what were people reading in these rooms and why might it matter? Well, most materials don't survive, so we don't always know. These libraries are very heavily dependent on book donations. So they're also, what you see on the shelves is not what the miners would have chosen to read. Even in surviving catalogues, we don't know how many things were chosen by a committee of the miners and how many things were slightly random donations from local people. At the minute, I'm writing an article, and I'll be giving a talk in a few weeks for Northumberland Archives, and it's because they have the only English surviving borrowing records that I know about. That's in relation to the lead mining library. So this is a slightly illicit photo on the left of their amazing lead mining library catalogue. And on the right, you can see they have numbers. The numbers correspond to the readers. And this is a particularly interesting page, because you probably can't see this in the Victorian handwriting, but on the left it says Waverley Novels. And in the research I've done on these borrowing records, the thing that lead miners were binge reading in the mid-Victorian period was Sir Walter Scott. People go all the way down the Sir Walter Scott list, borrowing one book after another. You can actually see on this page, people are borrowing Walter Scott, that's this number, and it's actually the same two numbers, and they're not borrowing anything else on that page. And that's really interesting for a number of reasons. One reason why they're reading Walter Scott, though, is simply that this is the only fiction that had been kind of pre-approved by the colliery manager as respectable fiction. So Scott managed to kind of toe that line between trashy enough that everybody wanted to read it, exciting, and respectable enough that it could be in a worker's library. And as I said, it's not really even these books that are important in the catalogue, it's the newspapers and periodicals. The other interesting thing I'm learning from this catalogue, and there'll be lots more about this in my talk for the Northumberland Archives, is that people didn't necessarily think you had to read a magazine in the year in which it was published. They were really interested in just reading magazines as light literature. So people were borrowing editions of magazines that were 20, 30 years old. Which is a change in reading practices, because I don't think we quite see magazines that way today. Okay, although I've been saying that there were lots of respectable books donated to libraries, and the evidence I found so far suggests they weren't the most borrowed or read, we do always need to bear in mind that Victorians who were very dedicated to improving themselves did also read many more religious works in particular than we might expect. And I think there can be a tendency that I'm also prone to underestimate just how interested people were in Christian works of literature. So this is just a little example from our archives of a Lancashire mill worker and miner, and quite late in the period too. And the three books that he seems to have left behind him were these: The Privileges and Responsibilities of Baptists and The Young Man's Counsellor, another religious work. And those still survive in the Lancashire archives, along with his papers. Of course, whether he kept them or whether they were donated because they were the respectable books and his daughter threw out all the unrespectable books, we don't know. Okay, so I'm going to move on to a couple of examples of people where an interest in a local site of reading, an interest in trades unionism or strike activity, and an interest in poetry coincide. This is Frederick Kitt, who wrote the article about the Airsdon Reading Room. and who was chairman of the Church Pit branch of the Miners' Union, who was also a Rechabite, that's one of the key temperance movements, a councillor and president of the Cooperative Society. Honestly, there's nothing like working on these Victorian industrial workers to wonder how on earth they found the time. They were all, on the committee of 7 different things and writing poetry and novels in the evening and holding down an extremely demanding and tough day job. And there's a little article here about Councillor F.J. Kitt in 1904, a working miner. He's long been known for his keen interest in literature. He's frequently contributed poems to local newspapers and periodicals. But typically of the people that we are locating in this project, although it says he's going to publish a book, we have not found the book. We don't believe it was ever published. So the only reason why we have, at the minute, this wonderful poem, The Pit Moose, about a mouse down the pit, is not even that I found it in a newspaper, because it's very, very hard to search newspaper databases for poetry. It's because another Ersdon poet, John Hume, cut the poem out of a newspaper and stuck it in his poetry scrapbook. And then his poetry scrapbook ended up in Northumberland archives as another of their great holdings. This poem, The Pit Moose, I can't do it in proper Northeast accent, I'm sorry to say, is not the only poem about a miner encountering a mouse in the pit. There are 2 poems from more or less the same period by Ayrshire poets, George McMurdo, and, I forgot my other one, but Arthur Wilson, 2 poems. And the Scottish ones are very heavily based on Burns, obviously. This is less heavily based on Burns, but in effect, any poem that you write about a mouse post 1800 is also about Robert Burns. All these poems about miners and mice are about the ways in which the struggle for survival of a small frightened animal down the pit and the daily struggle for survival of the miners in the pit are akin, and they're about the friendship that the miner shows to basically a pest that is regarded as, disposable to outsiders. They're about the friendship between man and animal in an industrial environment, which I think is really, really interesting. I'll tell you what else is really interesting. Not only is Frederick Kitt, the author of this poem, the chairman of the Miners' Union, but just last week, I traced both the other writers of miner and mouse poems to Keir Hardy's 1880s mining trade union journal, The Miner, which is the first place where one of these poems was published. And he seems to have, in fact, known both the other poets who were also union activists. So there you go, poems about mice and mining trades unionism. Ralph Dowie knew Fred Kitt, and he worked in the pit very nearby in New Delaval. And there was actually a picture of Ralph Dowie in the Mechanics Institute because he was so strongly linked to the Institute and its library. And he was also in the Cooperative Society, and he was also a trades unionist and linked to the Miners' Association, involved in some of its major disputes. And he writes several fantastic poems. This one was published in a magazine and circulated as a broadside, so it doesn't appear in a book. It's a fugitive poem. On the left, you can see another one of his poems, also from John Hume's scrapbook. A Shifter at Last is a particularly great poem. So when he's talking about a shifter, he's talking about people who go in at night to shore up the pit and work with carpentry and tidy things up before the colliers come in. So this is a job done by people who are too old to work on the coalface. It's regarded as a lesser form of employment. And that's why it's saying, now I'm aged, my best days are past, I'm only a shifter, an old shifter at last. And it's also about being disabled. I toddle to and fro the pit with a stick to support my own legs. My breath's short. So it's about, the miner's lung disease from breathing in coal dust. The young ones are all passing by and I have to stand back and let them past. This is actually, this whole poem, part of the movement to try and develop pensions, old age pensions for miners, because this is somebody who's very elderly and who's still being forced to work in a demanding and unpleasant job, despite, as we can see in this poem, being partially disabled. And this circulated as a cheap broadside and was sung as a song, like many of these poems. And lastly, someone I just found in the Leigh collection a few weeks ago when I was down in Leigh and Manchester. And I was very excited to find and trace him. Disappointingly, though, the Leigh collection, its great mining collection is all about Northumberland, I'm afraid, not about the Wigan miners, which I was hoping it would be. But they have both a broadside collection, and it's part of their Miners Advocate collection. And I know that there's a blog up on the Working Class Movement Library about the Miners Advocate. So all these broadsides, I am pretty sure, though I haven't had time to investigate it, were published by the same printer in Newcastle as that paper, and they're all linked to the strikes in Northumberland and Durham in 1844 and 1845. Oh, sorry. So Henderson Fawcett is another one who's a poet and an activist. This is a very typical Slaves of the Mine poem about going underground and about a terrible accident and weeping women and children and so forth. But it's a strike poem. It's not labelled as a strike poem, but that's what it is. And we can see that by its placing in this collection. And because the author of The Miner's Doom, which is Fawcett, also wrote Reasons Claim, the Miners' Plea to the Owners, which is specifically about these strikes, and which includes a lot of interesting comparisons, typical comparisons, between the state of the miners and the state of Afric slaves. That is, it's thinking about the abolition of slavery in Britain's colonies, and then making that common comparison to slavery in industrial occupations at home. And on the right is the Miners Advocate heading. Several of these poets appeared. So thankfully, Henderson Fawcett, having a name like Henderson Fawcett and not John Brown, I was able to track him in the newspaper archives as, again, a speaker at huge mass meetings of miners in relation to the strikes of the 1840s. And, you know, he was a leader in that movement. But I was also able to track his association with the Castle Eden Colliery Literary and Reading Society, because I found him giving a speech about it in 1862, where, as is typical, he talks about being a colliery hewer without education, but through using the reading materials supplied by this society, he became a subordinate officer. He actually becomes a kind of, I think it's a viewer or coal inspector. So this is a higher grade and better paid profession. And he talks about how when he moved to Castle Eden Colliery in the 1830s, 40s, there was only one newspaper, but now there are 200 newspapers distributed weekly in the colliery, many of which ended up in this society reading room. And that's his little, that's his new dot on the database on the right, only added last week, I think. So the concluding points I wanted to make are, when we look at any group of industrial workers, miners are a good example, but we're also looking at factory workers and at railway workers as our three key professions. They never operated in this, I feel inspired, so I'm going to sit in my lone garret writing a poem, you know, I'm going to go for a walk in the beautiful countryside and a sonnet will come to me as though I'm William Wordsworth. That is not the way that this worked, even though until quite recently, a lot of the scholarship of on working class literature would kind of give you this impression, because it's about exceptionalism. It's about exceptional individuals and how they manage to, you know, write poems or create books. It's quite biographical in focus often. What we're seeing is more clusters and collectives and acts of writing that are very dependent on community, but that also aren't about one person acquiring some books and reading them on their own. They're about communal reading spaces. They're about reading spaces that were also part of associational culture. So you weren't just going there to read, you were going there to listen to debates, you were going there to sing songs, you were going there to join meetings. As I already knew from an extensive study of Scottish local newspapers and working class poets, but as I'm now able to say definitively for the north of England too, literary culture for industrial workers did not one would not have existed without the rise of the popular press, the cheap press in Victorian Britain, and sympathetic newspaper editors who wanted to promote writers from their local area, partly because this is a way to fill your poetry column for free, but partly because every town and every area is engaged in a kind of cultural competition to demonstrate that they have more working class writers than the other area down the road or the other town down the road. So if you can show that there are 25 miners writing literature in your local town, then you win over the local town 100 miles away because, you know, your population are smarter and more educated. Libraries and reading rooms rarely existed in industrial areas without employer support, is what I think all our findings will demonstrate. But it will also demonstrate that though employers had their own reasons for founding these libraries and reading rooms, namely they're going to prevent union and strike activities, we see a very clear overlap in the individuals we study between union involvement and literary activity and being on the committee of your colliery reading room. That's a kind of overlapping series of circles. And as for what miners wrote, I've showed you a few poems about mining, but of course, miners wrote on all the standard themes of the Victorian period. They wrote about springtime and love and walks in the countryside and their old grannies and everything. But they did also very strongly use poetry to report in a form that was memorable and singable and easily circulated about the conditions of their labour. So poetry was a way of representing in a sympathetic way that would appeal to people and an effective way, as in it would make you feel as well as think, reporting in about the dreadful conditions underground for people who didn't work underground, to raise awareness of the need for change and development and to induce sympathy for the colliers, to show that they weren't just the kind of hard drinking, sporting, fighting stereotype that was very, very often circulated in the Victorian popular press and fiction, but that they were also educated and sensitive and familiar with works of literature and feeling individuals who should be supported and who deserved better conditions for their labour. Okay, I'm going to stop there, so I'll give you some time for questions before I run off. That was rather a whistle-stop tour, but thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. That was absolutely fascinating, Kirsty. Thank you. Adams said on Twitter that the project stands to really reshape how we see working class literature in the 18th and 19th century. So no pressure there with your conclusions, but no, that really has given us a fascinating insight. And I'm pretty sure the first link we've had between mice and trade unionism as well. So thank you for that.
I could have just given a talk about mice. I have been researching mice and rats in the mines now, Lynette. I'm really interested in what was going on with all these. I've got a poem to a midges in the mine as well, a Scottish miner that I'm very fond of. So, yeah.
Gosh,
I can see, and I'm just looking at a question from Franklin about did miners' poetry grow after the Education Act? Yes, it did, but I don't know that it's just the Education Act. Partly what you see in the 1880s, the 1890s, the 1910s is with the rise of wide socialist movements. And of course, you know, trade unions are now legal. More people can belong to a union. You get socialist newspapers, you get trade union newspapers, you get Labour Party newspapers, and these are all venues for miners to publish in. So the publishing culture shifts and the political culture shifts, and that encourages people to sit down and write a poem about their daily work. But I think we see so many people who were literate before the Education Act, more than you might expect, though still only a small percentage of the total mining workforce, that it doesn't necessarily make a massive difference. So if I just take that cluster of 1840s broadsides I was talking about in a folder in Leigh, there were maybe at least 5 to 10 names there unfamiliar to me, and I couldn't find them all. But that's 10 people all writing strike poetry from the same area. And one of them was a woman. We've only got 3, I think, women in our kind of mining bit of the database. because it's really hard to find. And 2 of them are listed, actually maybe all 3 of them are listed as miners' wives. So that's how they define themselves. We have yet to find any Lancashire pit lasses who wrote any poems. So if your great granny left a box under the bed full of manuscripts, you know, get that to us.
So why is the stuff in Leigh from Northumberland? Do you know?
I cannot tell you the answer to that question, Lynette, but I'd love to know.
Yeah,
it is. It is. I mean, it was very exciting, but also a shame, because I was hoping this would be a whole box of Wigan miners, so I could populate Wigan in the database a bit more. But I'm sure there's more to find.
Gosh, yes. Remind us how much longer have you got to be finding stuff? Where is the project up to?
We'll be working on the project up till now the end of 2022, but the database we hope will be launched at a conference and event in Manchester in August, which everybody is most welcome to attend. But the database will be funded to be supported for a decade as an outcome of the project. And people will be able to add entries. So I'm hoping that people will look at it and think, hang on a minute, where's my local place in the north? I bet we had some writers. I'm going to pop down to the library and have a look at this historic newspaper. Because every time you look at a historic newspaper, you know, in one day I can easily find 10 new database entries. But obviously, this is such a vast and untapped archive that we don't have time to do it all. So we want this to be a kind of, here's a glimpse of what was out there that we don't know about, and then other people can start contributing. And we hope that we'll be able to sneak our northern boundary down eventually to the Midlands, and I have hopes for Wales and Northern Ireland as well.
Right, gosh. Yes, folks, if you're able to come and see the exhibition Literature in the Mines, which is open on Friday afternoons between now and the 4th of February, we would love you to do that. And we've got a run of the Miners Advocate, which on the back page of most times does have a poem, doesn't it? As well as that lovely masthead that you showed as well. And we'd always be happy to show that. Always happy to get things out of cases for people, because our founders, Ruth and Eddie, really wanted people to absorb the information and sort of get up close to it. So yeah, if you're able to come on a Friday afternoon and find out more about this, that would be great.
So there's a question from Adam. This is a really great question about environmental themes. Do writers have a sense of the environmental damage of mining and its links to industry elsewhere? Yes and no. So I wrote quite a bit about Scottish miner poets in my book, Working Verse in Victorian Scotland, which is like a Oxford University Press hardback. But if you really want to read that chapter, just email me and I'll send you an illicit copy. And what I find there is that miners are very, very alert to pollution, and they write a lot, especially about rivers and streams and pollution. And they write a lot about, you know, their lack of access to nature due to being down the mine, but how important the natural world is to them. But there is also a strong subset of poems celebrating Britain's coal industry. And in particular, I found in Lanarkshire a whole set of poets who are saying, you know, we never see the blue sky, it's covered by smoke, but we don't care because that's an indication of how we're the most important industrial region in the world. Hooray for Coatbridge. So it's mixed. There's a lot of agitation around access to the natural world, access to the countryside, colliery owners and landowners shutting out working people from their estates. There's a lot of worry about the countryside being damaged or defaced. But this does go hand in hand with a sense of pride in Britain's industry and in being part of the coal industry that we also need to recognise as significant for that period.
You've made at least one Lanarkshire participant very happy there. I can see it. I can see. Does anybody want to wave at me and ask a question or make a comment? Maureen, do you want to unmute yourself?
Did the literary output continue until the end of mining? Were there poets in early 20th, mid 20th century?
There definitely were. My own knowledge sort of fizzles out kind of after World War I. But yes, there are still, when I'm looking in these local libraries and archives, there are often local anthologies, equally, I think, not very well known, or pamphlets of poetry by people who were working in the mines right up to the 1980s. So there is a culture there to uncover. My sense is it's maybe slightly better known, but it definitely existed. But what did happen, and what meant that this is different, is local newspapers stopped publishing a regular weekly poetry column full of poetry by the working people of their neighbourhood. So that culture, I don't think you really see so much. You know, you still get the occasional poem in the local press, but I don't think you see it so much after the mid-20th century, because that was standard, and that's really how this whole project came about, realising that that existed and that people were signing their poems A minor, X colliery.
Because I never feel that Lanarkshire gives a deep well of culture in the present day.
Well, maybe not. Maybe not. I can't speak to the present day, but I can tell you that there were a lot of poets in Lanarkshire in the Victorian period. And I had a lot of fun doing some mining and industry poems with school children in Lanarkshire. There was a lot of shouting and singing. And
you'll have been to Leigh Hills.
Yes, so I'm just writing a little bit about Leigh Hills. This is the, people who don't know, the lead miners library and museum up in the Lanarkshire Hills. So when I said, you know, I carefully said about the Allen Heads and Allen Mill lead miners library borrowers records, I said they're the only English ones. That's because Leigh Hills and Wanlock Head up in Lanarkshire have got Scottish borrowing records that historian John Crawford has done a lot of work on. So those are also fascinating. And I do have a later poet from that area as well, who was big in the Burns Society and wrote some great late 19th and early 20th century poems about lead mining.
We've certainly got material from miners up to the present day, and some of that is reflected in the material that we put in the display cases alongside the pop-up banners from Kirstie's project, because we wanted to sort of demonstrate that tradition continues. So they're taking the point that it doesn't get picked up in the newspapers in the same way at all.
Yeah.
Thank you, Maureen. Anybody else want to wave at me? Dave?
That was absolutely fascinating, Kirsty. Thanks very much. In your research, is there evidence of publications of these poems or pieces of fiction in collections? And also, is there evidence of any attempt to put the broadsheets, say, for sale on bookstalls, in any meetings or in any of the libraries? Would that have been feasible?
Broadsides would have been sold from stationers' shops. So stationers' shops in the 19th century were almost like a kind of library. A lot of people said they learned to read by standing in front of or in the stationer's shop, looking at the books and the broadsides in the window, or going in and getting them. They would have been sold and sung on the streets as well. Would they have been sold at meetings? Yes, probably. I mean, to be honest, quite often you wrote, a poem, you took it down to your local printer, like in Glasgow, the Poet's Box, you said, print me off 100 copies. And then you went into the pub and flogged those to your mates. Or in some cases, you just stood in the street corner and sold them. I imagine that for all those people I was talking about who were union members as well, that broadsides would have been sold at mass meetings and at union meetings, but I can't say that I found direct evidence of that. And then you were asking about anthologies. There's no 19th century anthology specifically of miners writing. So you do get a lot of late century local anthologies, and this is because of the competitiveness I was talking about between places. So you'll get, the poets of Ayrshire, and then you get the poets of Renfrewshire, the poets of Arbroath, the poets of Dundee, the Glasgow poets, the 27 volumes of modern Scottish poets. Similarly, you get the poets of Yorkshire in 3 volumes, the poets of Keighley, Bingley and Bradford, Lancashire Authors Association anthologies. So you get them by region, but you don't get them by profession. And those local anthologies do include some information often about people's professions, which is how we found a lot of poets. Some writers did manage to publish books. So Joseph Skipsey is a really, really well-known minor poet, and we have a banner for him. And he published multiple collections. He was known to the literary world. Gordon Tate, who did a PhD on him, found things like letters from Dante Gabriel Rossetti. So really communicating with very famous canonical Victorian authors. He was given a job. It was keeper of Shakespeare's birthplace, slightly random job to get him out of the mines, and he hated it. So he went straight back to the mines again a couple of years later. So there were the odd people, but the funny thing about Skipsey is there are all these articles saying he's totally exceptional. We can't believe he emerged in the pit. Look at this, amazing, unprecedented example. Meanwhile, I've got 3 other people in the same mine at the same time as Skipsey, also writing poetry. So I think the narrative got distorted then and now by this image of, the one really good writer who emerged from this culture antithetical to literary talent, whereas actually everybody with minimal education in the Victorian period appears to have been able to sit down and write a sonnet about spring and an ode to Robert Burns, and many of them did that, weekly.
Oh, message for us all there, golly, yes. Okay, so now Helen says, what a brilliant project. Did you find any evidence of women belonging to libraries, reading rooms, or women writing poetry? Realise they might not have used their own names, so it might have been difficult to find them.
Yeah, the last example I gave, the Castle Eden Literary Society, interestingly, in one little newspaper item on its founding, it said there were 66 members and 11 were women. And it doesn't say why. That's quite unusual. In the borrowers' records I'm looking at for the lead mining districts, there are 2 women listed in the catalogue. One was a servant to the guy who had basically established the library, so she probably had privileged access. And the other was the widow of a miner who had belonged to the library. So I think she was able to take over his membership briefly. But the evidence of reading is the borrowers' records. One of the reasons they're really, really interesting is because men are quite obviously borrowing books for their wives and their children. Like, it's hard to talk about this without talking about gendered stereotypes of reading, but I don't really believe that a man with a wife and 5 daughters is borrowing, all these sentimental American woman's fiction books to read himself, or a book like Cottage Cookery. I've got 3 minors borrowing Cottage Cookery. Where are they going to read it themselves, or where are they taking it home for other people? So women were using these places, but they weren't always allowed to be members. So they are excluded from a lot of the public social spaces that men belong to. And therefore, though they did write poetry, they do so less publicly and in a less findable way. Of course, women in mining communities had virtually no free time. They were not in a nice, warm, snug reading room with a piece of paper and a pen writing a poem. They were, lugging water around for baths and feeding children and cleaning the house and sorting everything out for men on shifts night and day. So they've got less time, they've got less leisure, they've got less access to educational opportunities, and they are not invited down the pub with the men to recite their poems. Nonetheless, in some contexts, and actually specifically in factories where the workplace is obviously the workforce is much more female, there were a number of female factory poets, and they're all very interesting, and we keep finding more of them. Women did also, however, tend to publish anonymously or pseudonymously much more, and that just makes them harder to find. They left less trace. Even where I have a named female author with a findable name, she doesn't come up in the newspaper records because she wasn't on the committee of all these male-oriented temperance associations and, Freemasons and on the Cooperative Society board and so forth. So she's not going to have left those historical traces. That's why everybody needs to find their granny's writings, because that's the only way we're going to recover a lot of these people.
Gosh, we've had some splendidly thorough responses from you, Kirsty. You really, really know your topic. It's always so fantastic to have people with such amazing knowledge and expertise to share with us. We are on a deadline today, so has anybody got any last thing you want to ask or say? Oh, there you go. Right, we are meeting your deadline, Kirsty. So that is great. Thank you so much. It has been genuinely fascinating, and I'm sure everybody would like to join with me in offering at least silent applause, but nonetheless heartfelt for that. Next week's talk, Thursday, the 1st of December at 2 o'clock, will be live in our annex as well as online. So if you'd like to come and join us, we'd love to see you in person, although we're very happy still to see you on Zoom, of course. And Mike Sanders' talk is entitled From Luddism to Chartism, John Stafford and the Creation of Radical Memory. He is, however, linked to the project with Kirsty, as we know. So if any of you have any follow-up questions or anything that you would like to talk to Mike about the project, I'm sure he'd be happy to talk about that as well. So today's talk has been recorded and will be uploaded to our YouTube channel shortly, and we'll be putting the link on the event webpage. A reminder that our talks are free. However, we would like to encourage you to support the library if you're able to do so. Thanks very much indeed to those of you who do that on a regular basis. We much appreciate it. There's a donate button on our website. Thanks again to Kirsty and to everyone for participating, and goodbye. I say it as ever, take care, in solidarity. Very best wishes from all at the Working Class Movement Library. Goodbye.
Thank you. Goodbye.